In the scorching heat of the African savanna, where death lurked behind every acacia tree, and survival meant outsmarting creatures 10 times your size, a young girl named Kasai would do something that had never been done before. She would look a pride of lions directly in the eyes, stand her ground when every instinct screamed to run, and in that moment of pure terror and courage, change the course of human history forever. This is not a fairy tale. This is not mythology. This is the story of how one girl, barely 16 summers old, faced down the most feared predators of her world and emerged not just alive, but as the ruler of the first human kingdom ever established. Long before pyramids kissed the sky, before cities rose from river valleys, before humans even dreamed of farming the land, there lived a girl who would prove that true power doesn't come from size or strength, but from the courage to stand firm when everything around you crumbles. What happened next would echo through a million years of human evolution, setting the foundation for every civilization that would follow. And it all began with one impossible choice: run and live as prey forever, or stand and fight for something greater than survival itself. Kasai crouched behind a massive boulder, her heart pounding so hard she was certain the hyenas could hear it from across the valley. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the African landscape in shades of gold and crimson, but she had no time to appreciate the beauty. Her people were dying, and she was the only one left who could do something about it. The girl pressed her face against the cool stone, peering around its edge to observe the scene below. Her tribe, the Wanderers as they called themselves, had been reduced to fewer than 30 souls. They huddled together near a dried riverbed, their makeshift camp nothing more than a few animal hide shelters and a struggling fire that threatened to die at any moment. These were her people, her family, and they were losing the battle for survival. Kasai's father, Django, sat apart from the others, his weathered hands holding his head in defeat. As the tribal leader, he had guided them through countless migrations, following the herds across the endless plains. But this season was different. The rains had failed completely, the great herds had moved far beyond their reach, and predators seemed to be everywhere. Lions, leopards, wild dogs, and hyenas had claimed territory around every water source for hundreds of miles. The Wanderers had become trapped in a deadly maze with no way out. She watched her mother, Asha, tend to the sick and wounded. 3 children had died in the past week alone, their small bodies unable to survive on the meager rations of roots, insects, and occasional small game that the hunters managed to bring back. The adults were growing weaker by the day, their ribs showing through their dark skin, their eyes losing the spark that had once driven them across continents in search of better lands. Kasai remembered when her tribe had been strong. She remembered her grandfather's stories of the time when they numbered in the hundreds, when their hunting parties could take down massive elephants, and their scouts knew every watering hole across the vast expanse of Africa. But those days seemed like distant dreams now. Climate change had transformed their world into something unrecognizable, and humans were still learning how to adapt. The 16-year-old girl had always been different from the others in her tribe. While other children played games and learned traditional skills, Kasai spent her time observing everything around her with an intensity that made the adults uncomfortable. She studied the behavior of animals, noting how they communicated, how they organized themselves, how they claimed and defended territory. She watched the way rivers flowed and changed course, how plants grew in different conditions, and how the weather patterns shifted with the seasons. Her unusual intelligence hadn't gone unnoticed. The tribe's elder, ancient woman named Temba had taken Kasai under her wing years ago, teaching her things that were usually reserved for boys. She learned to track animals by their footprints, to read the sky for signs of changing weather, and to identify which plants could heal and which could kill. Most importantly, Temba had taught her to think beyond the immediate moment, to see patterns and connections that others missed. But all of Temba's wisdom hadn't prepared Kasai for the crisis that now faced her people. The old woman had died 2 moons ago, leaving behind only whispered words about a great change that was coming. Her final words to Kasai had been cryptic and unsettling. "The time of wandering is ending, child. Soon, you must help our people learn to stay in one place, to make the earth serve them instead of always serving the earth." Now, crouched behind her boulder sanctuary, Kasai finally understood what Temba had meant. The old ways of following game and seasonal patterns were no longer enough. The world had changed too drastically, and humans needed to change with it or face extinction. But how could one girl convince an entire tribe to abandon everything they had ever known? The sound of approaching footsteps made her freeze. Someone was climbing the rocky slope toward her hiding place. Kasai gripped the sharp stone knife that hung from her belt, preparing to defend herself if necessary. But the voice that called out was familiar and safe. "Kasai, are you up there?" It was her younger brother, Tao, only 12 years old, but already showing the lean build of a natural hunter. He appeared around the boulder, his face etched with worry. "Father is looking for you. The council is meeting tonight." She followed Tao down the slope toward the camp, her mind racing with possibilities. The tribal council only met during the most serious circumstances, and she suspected she knew what they would be discussing. Several of the younger families had been talking about splitting off from the main group, believing they might have better chances of survival on their own. If the tribe fragmented now, none of them would live to see another season. The council fire had been built up higher than usual, casting dancing shadows across the faces of the 12 adults who formed the tribe's decision-making body. Kasai took her place in the outer circle with the other young people, officially too young to have a voice in tribal matters, but allowed to observe and learn. Her father stood in the center of the group, his tall frame looking somehow smaller than she remembered. "We cannot continue as we have," Jingo announced, his deep voice carrying across the quiet camp. "The hunting has failed, the gathering provides barely enough to keep the children alive, and we lose someone to predators or sickness every few days. We must make a choice." A man named Kofi, one of the tribe's most skilled hunters, stood up to respond. "The choice is clear. We must divide into smaller groups. Large tribes like ours are too easy for predators to track, and we consume resources too quickly. If we split into families or small hunting parties, some of us might survive." Several voices rose in agreement, but Kasai's mother stepped forward to oppose the idea. "And what happens to the old ones? The injured? The children too young to keep up? You speak of survival, but you're really talking about abandoning half our people to die alone." The argument continued for nearly an hour, with the council splitting into 2 distinct camps. Half wanted to fragment the tribe immediately, while the others insisted they should stay together and continue searching for better hunting grounds. Neither side seemed to have a realistic solution to their fundamental problem. They were losing the ancient struggle between humans and the natural world that surrounded them. Kasai listened to every word, her mind working furiously to process everything she was hearing. These adults, including her own parents, were all thinking within the same framework that had guided human tribes for countless generations. They saw themselves as part of the natural order, subject to its whims and limitations. But what if there was another way? The girl found herself standing up before she had consciously decided to speak. The entire council turned to look at her, surprise evident on their faces. Young people were expected to remain silent during these meetings, and her bold action violated every custom she had been taught. "What if we stopped wandering?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady despite her racing heart. "What if we found a place we could defend and make it ours permanently?" Her father's expression was a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "Kasai, this is not the time for childish fantasies. Please return to your place and let the adults discuss our real options." But Temba's teaching had given her confidence in her own thinking, and she refused to back down. "It's not a fantasy, Father. Think about it logically. We're failing because we're always moving, always trying to find resources that other creatures have already claimed. But what if we chose one location with water and good hunting, and then defended it like the lions defend their territory?" Kofi laughed harshly. "And how exactly would we defend anything against lions, girl? They're stronger, faster, and better armed than we are. Humans survive by avoiding confrontation, not by seeking it out." Kasai had anticipated this objection, and she was ready with an answer that would shock everyone present. "We would defend it by becoming more dangerous than the lions. Not through strength, but through intelligence and cooperation. Animals fight as individuals or small groups, but humans can coordinate dozens of people to work together toward a single goal." The council fell silent, processing her words. What she was suggesting went against every survival instinct their species had developed. Humans were prey animals, using their intelligence to avoid predators and find safe places to hide. The idea of actively challenging apex predators for territory was almost unthinkable. But as they sat in contemplative silence, each person began to realize that Kasai's radical proposal might be their only hope for survival. The old ways were clearly not working anymore. Perhaps it was time to try something that had never been attempted before. Her mother was the first to speak up in support. "Our daughter may be young, but she has always seen things differently than the rest of us. And right now, different might be exactly what we need." The debate that followed would continue until dawn, but Kasai could see that she had planted a seed of possibility in their minds. For the first time in months, her people were discussing something other than slow death or painful separation. They were talking about fighting back, about claiming their place in the world instead of simply trying to survive in it. As the night wore on and the council continued their discussions, Kasai slipped away from the fire to stand alone under the vast African sky. Somewhere out in the darkness, lions roared their territorial claims, unaware that a young human girl was preparing to challenge their ancient dominance. The first phase of her impossible plan was complete. Now came the truly dangerous part, putting her theories into practice. The stars above had witnessed the rise and fall of countless species over millions of years. But tonight, they were about to see something entirely new. The birth of the first human civilization, built on the foundation of one girl's refusal to accept that humans were destined to remain forever at the mercy of the wild world around them. 3 days after the council meeting, Kasai led a small scouting party through a narrow canyon that cut deep into the rocky hills north of their camp. The morning sun cast long shadows across the canyon floor, creating a maze of light and darkness that made every step treacherous. But she had studied this route for weeks, and she knew exactly where she was taking them. Behind her walked 5 of the tribe's most experienced adults, including her father and Kofi, the skeptical hunter who had opposed her plan most vocally during the council debate. They had agreed to let her show them this mysterious location she claimed would be perfect for establishing their permanent settlement. But their expressions made it clear they expected to be disappointed. The canyon walls rose higher as they walked deeper into the hills, eventually reaching heights of nearly 200 feet on both sides. Kasai had discovered this place during one of her unauthorized solo explorations, drawn by the sound of running water that echoed off the stone walls. What she had found exceeded even her most optimistic hopes. "How much further?" her father asked, his voice tight with the controlled tension he always displayed when he felt he was making a mistake. "We've been walking for 2 hours, and we're moving further away from any known hunting grounds." Kasai didn't answer immediately. She was listening carefully to the sound around them, making sure they hadn't attracted the attention of any large predators. The canyon offered excellent protection from most threats, but it could also become a deadly trap if they encountered something dangerous in the narrow passages. "Just around this next bend," she finally replied, quickening her pace slightly. "And, Father, what we find here will change everything you think you know about hunting grounds." The canyon curved sharply to the right, and suddenly they emerged into a hidden valley that took everyone's breath away. The valley floor stretched for nearly a mile in each direction, covered in lush grass that stayed green year-round thanks to an underground spring that bubbled up in the center. Game trails crisscrossed the entire area, showing that antelope, zebra, and other prey animals came here regularly to drink and graze. But the most impressive feature of the valley was its natural defensibility. The walls rose steeply on all sides except for the narrow canyon entrance they had just used. A small group of determined defenders could easily control access to the entire valley, making it nearly impossible for predators to enter without being detected. Kofi walked slowly around the spring, his experienced hunters taking in every detail of the terrain. "The water is clean and constant," he admitted grudgingly, "and there's clear evidence of regular game activity. But, Kasai, look at those hills surrounding us. This place is beautiful, but it's also a trap. If lions or leopards ever find their way in here, we'd have nowhere to run." Kasai had anticipated this concern, and she was prepared with a demonstration that would prove her point. She led the group to a pile of rocks she had carefully arranged during her previous visits, creating what looked like a natural formation, but was actually a sophisticated early warning system. "Watch the canyon entrance," she instructed, then began moving stones in a specific pattern. The sound of grinding rock echoed off the valley walls, amplified, and carried in such a way that anyone in the valley would immediately know that something was approaching from outside. "This is just one example," she explained as the echoes faded. "The canyon walls create natural acoustics that would let us hear anything coming from miles away. And look at those ledges halfway up the walls. A few people position up there with rocks, and spears could stop any predator from entering, no matter how large or aggressive." She spent the next hour showing them the defensive features she had identified throughout the valley. Natural choke points where large predators would be forced to approach single file. Hidden caves that could serve as emergency shelters. Elevated positions that would give human defenders significant advantages in any confrontation. But it was her father who identified the most important strategic element of the location. "The game trails," he said slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "They all converge near the spring, but they also continue deeper into the hills. This valley isn't just a destination for the animals. It's a crossroads." Kasai smiled, pleased that he had grasped the implications so quickly. "Exactly. We wouldn't just be settling near good hunting. we'd be controlling access to one of the most important water sources in this entire region. During dry seasons, every animal for dozens of miles would have to come through our territory to survive. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of following animal migrations and hoping to find game, they would position themselves at a location where game would be forced to come to them. It was a complete reversal of the traditional relationship between humans and their environment. An older woman named Delilah, one of the tribe's most skilled gatherers, had been quietly examining the plant life throughout the valley. "Kesai," she called out excitedly, "come look at this." She had discovered a grove of wild grain growing near one of the smaller springs. The grain was thick and healthy, producing more edible seeds than they had seen in months of traditional gathering. "And this isn't the only food source," Kesai added, leading them to several other areas she had already identified. "There are fruit trees, nut trees, edible roots, and medicinal plants growing all throughout the valley. We could potentially feed our entire tribe just from what grows here naturally." But Kofi still wasn't convinced about the defensive aspects of her plan. "You keep talking about fighting off predators, but you haven't explained exactly how we would do that." "Lions hunt in coordinated groups. They're faster and stronger than any human. Even if we could detect them coming, what would stop them from simply overwhelming our defenses?" This question went to the heart of Kesai's revolutionary strategy, and her answer would challenge everything these adults believed about human capabilities. "Because we're going to hunt them first," she said simply, "before they ever reach our valley." The statement sent a shock through the entire scouting party. Humans didn't hunt lions. Lions und humans. The suggestion that they could reverse this relationship seemed not just dangerous, but insane. "Think about it logically," Kesai continued, her voice gaining confidence as she explained her reasoning. "Lions are territorial animals. They follow predictable patterns, use regular hunting routes, and return to the same resting areas day after day. We can study those patterns, predict their movements, and strike at times and places of our choosing." She led them to a high ledge overlooking the canyon entrance and pointed toward distant hills where smoke from cooking fires could be seen rising. "There's a lion pride that controls the territory about 10 miles south of here. They follow the same circuit every 4 to 5 days, hunting near the river in the morning and moving to higher ground in the afternoon. If we wanted to eliminate them as a threat, we could set up an ambush at any number of locations along their route." Her father looked horrified. "Kesai, what you're suggesting is suicide. Even if we managed to kill 1 or 2 lions, the rest of the pride would hunt us down and slaughter our entire tribe." But she had thought through this objection as well. Not if we kill them all at once. And not if we did it in a way that made it look like they had been killed by another predator. Lions aren't the only dangerous animals in this region. There are leopards, wild dogs, hyenas, and other creatures that compete for the same territory. If a lion pride mysteriously disappeared, other predators would simply assume they had been driven off or eliminated by rivals. The more she explained her strategy, the more the adults began to realize that she had developed a complete military philosophy that went far beyond anything their people had ever attempted. She wasn't just talking about defending a territory. She was proposing that humans actively manage and control their environment through calculated violence and strategic deception. Delilah asked the question that was on everyone's mind, but how would we actually kill an entire pride of lions? They're incredibly dangerous, even when taken by surprise. Kesai walked them through a detailed plan she had been developing for weeks. Poison darts made from local plant toxins. Pit traps disguised as natural features of the landscape. Coordinated spear attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. fire used as both a weapon and a tool for herding lions into predetermined killing zones. The key is planning and patience, she explained. We study their habits for weeks until we know exactly where they'll be at any given time. Then, we spend days preparing our ambush site until every detail is perfect. When we finally strike, it won't be a battle. It will be an execution. As the sun reached its peak overhead, Keisai led the scouting party through one final demonstration. She had prepared a mock ambush scenario in a section of the canyon, showing exactly how a coordinated human attack could overwhelm much larger predators through superior planning and positioning. The demonstration was so convincing that even Kofi found himself nodding in approval. It could work, he admitted reluctantly. If everything went exactly according to plan, and if we managed to coordinate our movements perfectly, and if the lions reacted exactly as you predict they would react. That's a lot of ifs, her father pointed out. But Keisai was ready for this concern too. Every hunting expedition involves dozens of variables that could go wrong. Every migration route depends on weather patterns and animal behavior that we can't completely control. We're already living with uncertainty every single day. The only difference is that my plan gives us the possibility of taking control of our situation instead of remaining victims of it. The walk back to camp was conducted in thoughtful silence, as each member of the scouting party processed what they had seen and heard. They were being asked to consider the most dramatic change in human behavior since their ancestors had first learned to use tools. The transition from prey to predator, from wandering refugees to territorial conquerors, would require them to abandon nearly everything they had been taught about survival. But as they reached the main camp and saw the continuing deterioration of their people, the urgency of their situation became impossible to ignore. 2 more children had taken ill during their absence, and the hunting party that had left at dawn had returned empty-handed once again. The traditional ways were leading them towards certain extinction. That evening, as the scouting party reported their findings to the full tribal council, Keisai could see the mixture of fear and hope in the faces around the fire. They were terrified by the boldness of her proposal, but they were also beginning to believe that it might represent their only chance for survival. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than she had expected. 7 council members supported the plan to establish a permanent settlement in the Hidden Valley. 5 opposed it as too dangerous and radical. But the majority had spoken, and the wanderers would wander no more. As the meeting disbanded and people began making preparations for the monumental move to their new home, Keisai found herself standing alone at the edge of camp, looking out toward the distant hills where lions roared their ancient claims of dominance. Soon, those roars would be answered by something the African wilderness had never heard before: the organized war cry of humans who had decided to fight for their place in the world. The migration to the Hidden Valley took 3 days of careful movement, with scouts constantly watching for predators, and the weakest members of the tribe carried on improvised stretchers. Keisai had insisted that they move in small groups to avoid attracting attention, reuniting only after everyone had safely reached their new home. The first week in the valley was spent establishing basic shelters and organizing their new settlement according to Keisai's detailed plans. She had positioned the main camp near the central spring, but elevated enough to provide clear views of all approaches. Cooking fires were built in locations where the smoke would be dispersed by natural wind patterns, making their presence less obvious to potential threats. But the most important construction project was the creation of the early warning system that would give them advance notice of any approaching dangers. Working teams spent days positioning resonating stones throughout the canyon and establishing a network of observation posts on the high ledges. By the end of the first week, anyone entering the valley would be detected long before they could pose a threat to the settlement. The system was tested for the first time on the 8th day, when a small herd of antelope wandered into the valley to drink at the spring. The acoustic warning network worked perfectly, giving the hunters time to position themselves for what turned out to be their most successful hunting expedition in months. The psychological effect on the tribe was enormous. For the first time since the crisis began, they felt like they had some measure of control over their circumstances. But Kasai knew that their real test was still coming. The lion pride that controlled the territory south of the valley would eventually discover their presence. And when that happened, everything would depend on whether her military theories could be successfully translated into practice. She had spent the migration period and the first week of settlement carefully studying the behavioral patterns of the local lion pride. Using a combination of distant observation and tracking of their territorial markings, she had mapped their movement patterns with remarkable precision. The pride consisted of 2 adult males for adult females and 6 cubs of various ages. They followed a predictable circuit that brought them within 3 miles of the valley entrance every 4th day. The opportunity for action came sooner than expected. On the 10th day in the valley, her scouts reported that the pride had killed a zebra near one of the water holes along their regular route. Based on their established patterns, they would spend the rest of that day feeding and resting near the kill site, then move to their favorite sleeping area just before sunset. That sleeping area was a rocky outcropping surrounded by dense thorn bush, offering excellent protection from other predators, but also creating a natural trap for anything inside. Kasai had identified it weeks earlier as the ideal location for her first major military operation. The plan she presented to the tribal council that afternoon was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. 12 volunteers would leave the valley that evening, carrying weapons and supplies for a coordinated night attack on the entire pride. The assault would take place in the hours before dawn, when lions were typically at their drowsiest and least alert. The risks are enormous, her father acknowledged when the plan was presented for approval. If anything goes wrong, we could lose our best hunters and fighters in a single night. That would leave the rest of us defenseless. But Kofi, who had emerged as one of Kasai's strongest supporters since seeing the valley, argued persuasively for taking action. The bigger risk is doing nothing. That pride will find our valley eventually, and when they do, we'll be facing them on their terms instead of ours. At least this way, we choose the time and place of the confrontation. The vote was unanimous. Every member of the tribal council agreed that the time for passive survival strategies had passed. They would either establish themselves as a force to be respected in this territory, or they would die attempting to do so. Kasai spent the rest of the day preparing for the most important night of her life. She selected a team of 9 adult volunteers, plus herself, and 2 other young people who had proven themselves during the recent hunts. Each team member was assigned specific responsibilities within the overall attack plan, and they spent hours rehearsing their coordination until every movement was perfectly synchronized. The weapons they carried were unlike anything humans had ever used against large predators. Instead of the traditional spears designed for hunting antelope and smaller game, Kasai had overseen the creation of specialized equipment designed specifically for killing lions. Heavy, thrusting spears with broad points that could penetrate deep into vital organs. Throwing spears with detachable heads that would remain embedded in the target even if the shaft was broken. Most innovatively, they carried clay pots filled with a mixture of plant toxins and animal fat that could be thrown to create poisonous smoke when ignited. The team left the valley as the sun was setting, moving silently through the gathering darkness toward their target. Kasai led them along a route she had scouted repeatedly, avoiding the main game trails where their scent might be detected by other predators. The journey took nearly 4 hours of careful movement through increasingly dangerous territory. They reached the vicinity of the lion's sleeping area just after midnight, positioning themselves according to a plan that had been refined through countless discussions and rehearsals. The outcropping where the pride slept was surrounded by thorny vegetation that created natural barriers on 3 sides. Kasai had decided to use these barriers to their advantage, positioning teams at each of the 2 possible escape routes while the main assault group approached from the most difficult direction. The lions were exactly where her observations had predicted they would be, sleeping in a loose cluster near the base of the rocky outcropping. The 2 adult males lay slightly apart from the females and cubs, their massive forms barely visible in the starlight filtering through the acacia trees overhead. Kasai gave her team time to settle into their positions, then initiated the attack with a signal that had been agreed upon days earlier. She struck 2 stones together sharply, creating a sound that echoed off the rocky surfaces around them. The noise was loud enough to wake the lions, but not distinctive enough for them to immediately identify its source. What happened next unfolded with the precision of a perfectly executed hunt, but on a scale that no human had ever attempted before. As the lions began to stir and look around in confusion, clay pots filled with poisonous mixture were thrown from 3 different directions simultaneously. When the pots shattered against the rocks, they created clouds of toxic smoke that immediately began affecting the breathing and coordination of everything in the immediate area. The lions tried to flee, but they found their escape routes blocked by coordinated spear attacks from teams that had positioned themselves precisely where Kasai's analysis predicted the animals would run. The confusion created by the smoke, combined with the coordinated nature of the human attack, prevented the lions from organizing any effective resistance. The battle was over in less than 10 minutes. Every member of the pride had been killed, and not a single human had been seriously injured. The only wounds suffered by Kasai's team were minor cuts and scrapes sustained during the approach march and the final cleanup phase of the operation. But the true significance of what had happened went far beyond the tactical success of the attack itself. For the first time in human history, a group of people had demonstrated that they could systematically eliminate apex predators through superior planning and coordination. The fundamental relationship between humans and the natural world had been permanently altered. The return journey to the valley was conducted in a state of stunned excitement as team members gradually realized the magnitude of what they had accomplished. They had proven that Kasai's military theories could be successfully implemented in practice, opening the door to possibilities that had never before seemed realistic. News of the successful operation spread throughout the tribe within hours of the team's return. The psychological transformation was immediate and profound. People who had spent their entire lives fearing the night, sounds of predators, now walked with confidence and purpose. Children who had grown up believing that humans were destined to remain prey animals began asking to be taught the new fighting techniques. But Kasai understood that one successful battle did not guarantee long-term survival. The elimination of the local lion pride would create a power vacuum that other predators would eventually attempt to fill. Leopards, wild dogs, hyenas, and lions from neighboring territories would all be drawn to the newly available hunting grounds. She spent the days following the battle developing plans for dealing with these anticipated challenges. The valley's defensive systems were expanded and improved based on lessons learned during the first military operation. Training programs were established to teach every able-bodied member of the tribe the basics of coordinated fighting techniques. Most importantly, she began planning a series of follow-up operations designed to establish a buffer zone around the valley where no large predators will be allowed to establish permanent territories. The concept was ambitious beyond anything humans had ever attempted. The creation of a safe zone maintained through systematic violence against any creature that threatened their security. The third week in the valley brought the first test of these expanded defensive strategies. A pack of wild dogs, drawn by the scent markings left behind by the eliminated lion pride, attempted to establish a new territory that included the approaches to the valley entrance. Kasai's scouts detected their presence within hours of their arrival, and a strike team was dispatched that same evening. The operation against the wild dogs was even more successful than the lion attack had been. The team returned before dawn with proof that every member of the pack had been eliminated, and this time they had managed the entire operation without using any of their precious poisonous materials. Word of these successes began to spread beyond Kasai's immediate tribe. Other human groups in the region, most of them facing the same survival pressures that had nearly destroyed the Wanderers, sent scouts to investigate the rumors of a tribe that had learned to fight back against predators. These investigating parties found a settlement that seemed impossible by all traditional standards, a permanent human community that was not only surviving, but actually thriving in territory that had previously been dominated by dangerous carnivores. The first delegation of potential refugees arrived at the valley entrance 4 weeks after the initial lion battle. They were representatives of a group called the River Followers, nearly 40 people who had been driven from their traditional territories by a combination of drought and predator pressure. Their leader, an experienced hunter named Bakery, requested permission to join Kasai's settlement in exchange for contributing their skills and labor to the community's defense. The request created the first major political challenge of the new settlement. Traditional tribal customs dictated that refugees could be taken in temporarily, but that permanent integration required lengthy negotiations and careful consideration of resource allocation. But Kasai recognized that the growth of their population would strengthen their military capabilities and make possible even more ambitious territorial expansion. Her argument to the tribal council was straightforward. They had proven that organized humans could defeat individual predators, but their ultimate goal should be to establish dominance over the entire region. That would require a much larger population than their original tribe could provide. The decision to accept the River Followers marked another revolutionary departure from traditional human social organization. Instead of maintaining the closed kinship structures that had characterized nomadic tribes for countless generations, they were beginning to create something entirely new, a territorial community that could grow through the voluntary addition of outside groups. The integration process took several weeks, during which the newcomers were taught the military techniques and territorial strategies that had made the valley settlement successful. But the process also enriched the original community by introducing new skills and perspectives that enhanced their overall capabilities. By the end of their second month in the valley, Kasai found herself leading a community of nearly 70 people who controlled a territory that extended for miles in every direction from their central settlement. They had eliminated or driven off every large predator in the immediate area, established a sustainable food production system, and created the foundation for something that had never existed before, a permanent human civilization built on the principle of territorial dominance rather than nomadic adaptation. 6 months after the first lion battle, Kasai stood on the highest observation platform, overlooking her rapidly expanding domain, and realized that she was no longer simply a tribal member with unusual ideas. She had become something unprecedented in human history, a military commander whose authority extended over multiple groups of people united not by blood relationships, but by shared commitment to a revolutionary way of life. The transformation had happened gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. As more refugee groups arrived seeking protection and alliance, the traditional tribal council structure had proven increasingly inadequate for making the complex decisions required to manage a growing territorial state. Military operations required split-second timing and absolute unity of command. Diplomatic negotiations with potential allies demanded consistent policies that couldn't be constantly revised through lengthy group discussions. The crisis that forced a fundamental change in their leadership structure came when 3 different groups arrived at the valley entrance within a single week. The cliff dwellers from the eastern mountains had been driven from their homes by a volcanic eruption that poisoned their water sources. The sand walkers from the southern deserts were fleeing a drought that had lasted for 2 full seasons. The tree climbers from the northern forests had been decimated by a disease outbreak that killed more than half their population. Each group brought valuable skills and knowledge, but they also brought immediate needs for food, shelter, and protection that strained the settlement's resources. More critically, they brought conflicting ideas about how the community should be organized and what their priorities should be for future expansion. The traditional council system collapsed completely when faced with these multiple simultaneous challenges. Debates that had once taken hours now lasted for days, with representatives of different groups arguing for policies that would benefit their particular constituencies. Military operations that should have been launched immediately were delayed, while political discussions dragged on endlessly. The breaking point came when scouts reported that a massive pride of lions, much larger than any they had previously encountered, was moving toward their territory from the west. This was no ordinary hunting party, but a displaced super pride that had been forced out of their original territory by human expansion in distant regions. The pride consisted of at least 6 adult males, 10 females, and numerous cubs, making it far too powerful to be defeated through the tactics that had worked against smaller groups. When the tribal council proved unable to reach any decision about how to respond to this threat, Kasai took action on her own authority. She assembled a strike force of the most experienced fighters from all the different groups, bypassed the stalled political process entirely, and launched a preemptive operation that successfully eliminated the super pride before it could reach their territory. The operation required 3 days of careful maneuvering and 2 separate battles, but it resulted in total victory without the loss of a single human life. More importantly, it demonstrated conclusively that effective military action required unified command rather than collective decision-making. When Kasai returned to the settlement with proof of her success, she found that the political dynamics had shifted dramatically in her absence. Representatives of all the different groups were waiting to formally request that she assume permanent leadership of the community. The traditional council structure was officially dissolved, replaced by a new system that concentrated military and diplomatic authority in the hands of a single supreme leader. The ceremony that established Kasai as the first human queen was simple but profound in its implications. Standing before the assembled population of the Valley settlement, she accepted responsibility not just for the survival of her people, but for the expansion and development of what was becoming the first human kingdom. Her first official act as queen was to announce a comprehensive plan for territorial expansion that would extend their control over the entire river system that fed their valley. This was an enormously ambitious project that would require coordinated military operations across hundreds of square miles. But it was also the logical next step in establishing permanent human dominance over their environment. The expansion campaign began immediately, with strike teams moving out simultaneously in 4 different directions to eliminate predator populations and establish outposts at strategic locations throughout the target territory. Each outpost would be garrisoned by a mixed force drawn from all the different tribal groups, creating a unified military structure that transcended traditional kinship loyalties. The campaign lasted for 3 months and resulted in the complete pacification of an area that encompassed nearly 2,000 square miles of prime hunting and gathering territory. More importantly, it established a pattern of systematic territorial conquest that could be repeated indefinitely as their population and military capabilities continued to grow. But Keisai's vision extended far beyond military conquest. She understood that permanent territorial control required the development of sustainable economic systems that could support a growing population without depleting natural resources. The nomadic lifestyle that had characterized human existence for countless generations had been based on the principle of taking what nature provided and moving on before resources were exhausted. But territorial civilization required learning to actively manage and improve the environment rather than simply exploiting it. The agricultural revolution began with careful observation of the wild grain that grew naturally in several areas of their expanded territory. Instead of simply harvesting what grew naturally, Keisai organized teams to clear larger areas and deliberately plant seeds and organize patterns that would produce higher yields. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of depending on nature to provide food, humans could actively create the conditions for increased food production. The first experimental crops exceeded all expectations, producing enough grain to feed the entire population for several months. But more importantly, they demonstrated that systematic environmental management could create abundance rather than simply extracting existing resources until they were depleted. This success with grain cultivation led to expanded experimentation with other food sources. Root vegetables were transplanted from their wild locations to specially prepared fields near the settlement. Fruit trees were protected from animal predation and given additional water during dry periods to increase their production. Even the natural spring that provided their water supply was modified through careful engineering to increase its flow and create irrigation systems for the expanding agricultural areas. The transformation from nomadic hunting and gathering to settled agriculture happened with remarkable speed once the basic principles were established. Within a year of her coronation as queen, Keisai's kingdom was producing enough food to support a population nearly 3 times larger than the original tribal group that had first entered the valley. This agricultural abundance created opportunities for social development that had never been possible under nomadic conditions. Individuals could specialize in particular skills rather than everyone needing to know all the basics of survival. Craftspeople emerged who focused exclusively on making tools, weapons, and other manufactured goods. Builders developed techniques for creating permanent structures that could last for decades rather than the temporary shelters that had characterized nomadic life. Most importantly, the surplus food production made possible the support of a professional military class that could dedicate full-time to training, planning, and conducting operations to expand and defend their territory. This professional army was far more effective than the part-time militia that had characterized their early military operations, and it made possible much more ambitious territorial expansion projects. The second major expansion campaign was launched in the spring of Keisai's second year as queen. This operation targeted the mountainous region to the east, where several competing human groups were struggling to survive in territories dominated by leopards and other mountain predators. Rather than simply eliminating the predators and claiming the territory for themselves, Keisai implemented a new policy of offering protection and alliance to existing human populations in exchange for their voluntary integration into her kingdom. This diplomatic approach proved even more successful than pure military conquest. Entire tribes joined the kingdom voluntarily, bringing their knowledge of local conditions and specialized mountain survival skills. The integration process was managed carefully to ensure that newcomers were fully incorporated into the kingdom's military and economic systems while still being allowed to maintain their distinctive cultural practices. By the end of the second expansion campaign, Queen Keisai ruled over a kingdom that encompassed more than 5,000 square miles and included a population of nearly 300 people drawn from dozens of different original tribal groups. The kingdom controlled all the major water sources in the region, the most productive hunting territories, and the best agricultural land available anywhere in their known world. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement was the social transformation that had taken place within the kingdom itself. The rigid kinship structures that had traditionally defined human social organization had been replaced by a merit-based system that rewarded competence and loyalty regardless of family background. Individuals from any of the component tribal groups could advance to positions of leadership within the military, agricultural, or administrative systems based on their demonstrated abilities. This social mobility created a level of unity and shared purpose that had never been achieved by any previous human society. People who had grown up in completely different cultures with different traditions and beliefs found themselves working together toward common goals that benefited everyone in the kingdom. The artistic and intellectual developments that emerged from this social transformation were equally revolutionary. With basic survival no longer requiring everyone's full attention, individuals had time and energy to devote to creative pursuits that had never been possible under nomadic conditions. Complex decorative arts emerged, along with sophisticated storytelling traditions that celebrated the kingdom's achievements and preserved its history for future generations. But it was the development of strategic planning capabilities that most clearly demonstrated the intellectual advancement of Keisai's people. The queen herself had evolved from a clever girl with unusual ideas into a sophisticated military and political strategist capable of managing complex multi-year campaigns involving hundreds of people and vast territories. Her plans for the kingdom's future were ambitious beyond anything that any previous human had ever conceived. She envisioned a network of allied cities controlling all the major river systems across the continent, connected by trade routes and mutual defense agreements that would ensure permanent security for human civilization. The foundation for this grand vision was already being established through the kingdom's third major expansion campaign, which focused on establishing outposts and alliances in the river valleys to the north and south. These operations combined military conquest with diplomatic negotiation and economic development in ways that created lasting relationships with local populations rather than simple temporary occupation. As Queen Keisai approached her 20th birthday, she commanded a kingdom that had become the dominant force across a territory larger than many modern nations. She had transformed a dying tribe of nomadic refugees into the foundation of human civilization itself. But She was also beginning to realize that her greatest challenges lay not in military conquest or territorial expansion, but in the far more complex task of creating institutions and systems that could preserve and extend her achievements long after her own lifetime had ended. The young queen who had once faced down lions with nothing but courage and determination had become the architect of humanity's first great experiment in permanent civilization. And as she looked out over her thriving kingdom from her palace built into the valley walls, she was already planning the next phase of a transformation that would echo through all of human history. 10 years had passed since Queen Kasai first faced the lions and claimed her kingdom, and the world had transformed beyond all recognition. Standing in the grand hall of her palace, now carved deep into the living rock of the valley walls and decorated with artistic treasures from across the known world, she could barely remember the desperate girl who had once hidden behind boulders while her people slowly died. The kingdom now sprawled across an area that would have taken months to cross on foot, encompassing dozens of cities and towns connected by well-maintained roads that allowed rapid movement of people, goods, and information. The population had grown to over 10,000, making it larger than many civilizations that wouldn't emerge for thousands of years in the future. But the true measure of her achievement wasn't found in numbers or territory. It was visible in the faces of the children who played in the palace gardens without any fear of predators, who had never known hunger or homelessness, and who took for granted luxuries that would have seemed like impossible dreams to their grandparents. An entire generation had grown up believing that humans were naturally the dominant species on Earth, never imagining that there had ever been a time when their people lived in constant terror of wild animals. The morning brought delegations from 3 different kingdoms that had been established by former members of Kasai's original expansion campaigns. Over the years, as the territory under her direct control had grown too large for effective centralized management, she had granted independence to outlying regions while maintaining alliances and trade relationships that created a network of friendly states across the continent. The first delegation was led by King Django, Kasai's own father, who had been granted rulership over the Eastern Mountain Territories when they achieved autonomous status 5 years earlier. His kingdom specialized in mining operations that provided metal for weapons and tools throughout the Alliance network. The transformation in her father was remarkable. The defeated man, who had once sat holding his head in despair, had become a confident leader who commanded respect from subordinates and allies alike. The second delegation represented Queen Asha, Kasai's mother, whose coastal kingdom controlled the fishing territories along the great inland sea that had been discovered during the 4th expansion campaign. Her people had developed revolutionary fishing techniques and boat-building capabilities that provided protein for populations far inland through an extensive trade network. The third delegation came from a newest member of the Alliance, King Bakery of the Southern Plains Kingdom. He had been the refugee leader who first sought alliance with Kasai's original settlement, and his territory he now controlled the vast grasslands where enormous herds of migrating animals were systematically managed to provide sustainable food sources for the entire alliance. But this wasn't just a family reunion or diplomatic conference. The delegations had come to participate in the most important ceremony in the kingdom's history, the formal establishment of the Great Council, a permanent governing body that would coordinate policies and resolve disputes among all the allied kingdoms. The Great Council represented Kasai's solution to the fundamental challenge facing any successful civilization: how to preserve unity and cooperation across multiple generations and vast territories. She had watched other ambitious leaders rise and fall throughout the region, usually because their achievements died with them or crumbled in a civil war among their successors. The ceremony establishing the Great Council took place in the main temple, a magnificent structure that had been carved from a natural cave system and expanded over years of careful engineering. The temple walls were covered with detailed historical records that chronicled every major achievement of the kingdom, from the first lion battle to the most recent diplomatic treaties with distant trading partners. Representatives from dozens of cities, allied kingdoms, and trading partners witnessed as Kasai formally transferred many of her royal powers to the new council structure. Military command would remain centralized under royal authority during times of crisis, but economic policy, territorial expansion decisions, and diplomatic relations would be managed collectively by elected representatives from each member kingdom. The system was designed to ensure that the alliance could survive the death of any individual leader, including Kasai herself. More importantly, it created mechanisms for peaceful expansion that could incorporate new territories and populations without the military campaigns that had characterized the early years of the kingdom's development. But even as she participated in this ceremony that represented the culmination of her political achievements, Kasai's mind was focused on an even more ambitious project that had occupied her thoughts for the past several years. Deep beneath the palace, in chambers that were accessible only to her most trusted advisors, work was proceeding on what she privately called the Archive of All Knowledge. The Archive was Kasai's attempt to preserve not just the history of her kingdom, but the complete accumulated knowledge of human civilization as it existed in her time. Every technique for weapons making, every agricultural method, every diplomatic strategy, every military tactic, every artistic achievement, and every scientific discovery was being carefully documented and stored in a way that could survive natural disasters, wars, or any other catastrophe that might threaten the kingdom's survival. The project had begun when she realized that much of the knowledge that had made her kingdom's success possible existed only in the memories of individual specialists. If those people died unexpectedly, crucial capabilities could be lost forever. The archive was designed to ensure that future generations would have access to all the innovations that had transformed human existence from nomadic subsistence to territorial civilization. But the archive wasn't just a library or record-keeping system. It included detailed training programs that could teach essential skills to people who had never been exposed to them before. Complete instructions for establishing new settlements, organizing military campaigns, developing agricultural systems, and creating trade relationships with neighboring populations. Most importantly, the archive contained Kasai's personal analysis of the fundamental principles that had made human civilization possible. Her observations about the psychology of leadership, the dynamics of social organization, the economics of resource management, and the strategic requirements for long-term territorial control. This theoretical framework was perhaps her most important contribution to human development. Previous human societies have been limited by their inability to think systematically about social organization and strategic planning. Kasai had developed the first comprehensive philosophy of civilization that could be taught to others and applied in completely different geographic and cultural contexts. The testing of this educational system had already begun in the most remote territories of the Alliance, where young leaders were being trained using archive materials to establish new settlements in previously unexplored regions. The early results exceeded all expectations, with new communities achieving in months what had taken Kasai's original group years to accomplish. As the formal ceremonies concluded and the various delegations prepared to return to their home kingdoms, Kasai found herself alone in her private chambers, contemplating the extraordinary transformation that had taken place during her lifetime. The world map that covered one entire wall of the room showed the extent of human territorial control as it existed in her time, with allied kingdoms, trading partners, and friendly settlements marked across thousands of miles of territory. But she also understood that her personal contribution to this transformation was nearing its end. At 26, she was already considered elderly by the standards of her time, and she had no intention of clinging to power beyond her ability to exercise it effectively. The Great Council system had been designed partly to ensure a smooth transition of authority to the next generation of leaders. Her chosen successor was her younger brother Tao, now a seasoned military commander and diplomat who had been carefully prepared for leadership responsibilities over the past several years. But the transition wouldn't be a traditional royal succession. Under the new system, Tao would need to be elected by the Great Council and confirmed by representatives from all the allied kingdoms. This democratic element was another of Keisai's innovations, designed to ensure that future leaders will be chosen based on their competence and popular support rather than simply their family connections. She had observed too many promising civilizations destroyed by incompetent hereditary rulers to allow that weakness to undermine her own achievements. The formal transition ceremony was scheduled for the following spring, but Keisai had already begun gradually transferring her responsibilities to other leaders while she focused on completing the archive project. Her final major work would be a comprehensive memoir that would serve as a guidebook for future leaders facing the challenges of civilizational development. The memoir was more than just a personal history. It was a detailed analysis of decision-making processes, strategic planning methods, and leadership techniques that could be studied and adapted by future generations. She wrote about the psychology of courage, the importance of calculated risk-taking, and the delicate balance between individual initiative and collective cooperation. But perhaps the most important section of the memoir dealt with what she called the lion principle, the recognition that true leadership requires the courage to face seemingly impossible challenges with determination and intelligence rather than avoiding them through passive strategies. She had observed that most human societies fail because their leaders tried to minimize risk rather than actively managing it. They sought safety through isolation and defensiveness rather than security through strength and proactive action. The Lion Principle taught that lasting success required leaders to identify their most dangerous challenges and confront them directly rather than hoping they would somehow resolve themselves. As winter approached and Keisai worked on the final sections of her memoir, reports arrived from the most distant outposts of the Alliance, describing the discovery of new continents and previously unknown human populations. The world was proving to be far larger and more diverse than anyone had imagined, creating opportunities for expansion and development that could continue for countless generations. But there are also disturbing reports of aggressive human societies in some of these distant regions. Groups that had developed military capabilities comparable to her own kingdom, but without the diplomatic and economic systems that had allowed peaceful expansion and integration. The possibility of large-scale warfare between competing human civilizations was becoming a realistic concern for the first time in history. These reports reinforced Keisai's belief that her most important legacy would be the institutional and educational systems that could help future leaders navigate increasingly complex challenges. The Archive Project and the Great Council structure were designed to provide the tools and knowledge necessary for maintaining peace and prosperity even in the face of external threats and internal conflicts. On the night she completed her memoir, Kasai climbed to the highest tower of her palace to look out over the kingdom she had created from nothing but determination and intelligence. The lights of dozens of cities twinkled in the distance, connected by roads that carried continuous traffic even in the darkest hours. The valley that had once echoed with the roars of lions now hummed with the sounds of human industry and commerce. But the greatest satisfaction came from watching the children who played in the palace courtyards, children who had never known fear or hunger, who expected the world to provide them with opportunities and security, who believed that humans were naturally the dominant species on Earth. Those children would grow up to accomplish things that would make even her revolutionary achievements seem small by comparison. Standing under the stars that had once witnessed her desperate flight from pursuing predators, Queen Kasai understood that she had accomplished something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. She had led her species across the threshold from animal survival to conscious civilization. She had proven that intelligence and cooperation could overcome any obstacle, no matter how powerful or dangerous. The lions still roared somewhere in the distant wilderness beyond her kingdom's borders, but their voices no longer carried the ancient threat of human extinction. Instead, they served as a reminder of how far her people had traveled from the dark days when death stalked their every movement. The girl who had once hidden behind rocks in terror had grown into the woman who had claimed dominion over the world itself. Her legacy would endure not in the monuments and palaces that bore her name, but in the countless generations of humans who would inherit a world where civilization was possible, where cooperation could triumph over conflict, and where the courage to face impossible challenges could transform dreams into reality. She had faced the lions and won not just a single battle, but the war for humanity's future itself.